10 of the first PUC English course book is an article or is an essay on Fredrick Douglass. Now, as we all know, Fredrick Douglass was one of the slave fighters or one of the African slaves who was actually a slave leader in the United States of America. As we all know that for centuries in the United States of America, so there used to be the natives, but after the invasion by the Europeans, especially Columbus and the other travelers who went from the European countries, they started having the estates, they started having their own establishments, they started having their own factories and companies and also fields, and they wanted people to work in their fields and also in their establishments. And the easy way that they could get the people to work in the fields were by going back to the African continent where they had their colonies and buy people at the human market and take them as slaves. Many were slaves, many were bond slaves or bonded slaves. What is the meaning of a bonded slave? A slave basically is the one who is sold to the master and he has to live according to the whims and fancies of the master. But a bond slave is the one who doesn't even have a right to his own life. However, his slave master is going to treat him, he has to live and he has to be under the master as long as the master wishes. So, this tradition of the slave or the tradition of slavery continued for hundreds of years in the United States of America. Finally, there was a big movement for the right to equality for these slaves, and many of these slaves, their lives used to be so miserable because they were not properly fed. Secondly, the slave ladies, they were taken as concubines or as maids by the masters, and the children which were born out of this relationship, of course, were also made to be slaves. They were not given the identity of the slave masters. Instead, they also thought to be people who would work for the slave masters. So, now let us see about this particular essay. So, Fredrick Douglass was born in Tuckahoe near Hillsborough, about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County in Maryland. He did not have the accurate knowledge of his age. Most of the slaves like him did not know their age, just like horses did not know theirs. Now, the writer of this essay tells that Fredrick Douglass did not know his age like many other slaves of his time, because the slaves were not supposed to ask for their age or not supposed to know their age, and they were just made to work all the time. Just like horses, they did not have their own identity. They were almost treated equal to animals. This was quite common among the slaves, and even their masters wanted them to be like that, and hence the slaves would often refer to their birthday or year to that of planting time, harvest time, cherry time, spring time or fall time, etc. So, since these slaves did not have their own, did not remember their own birthdays, and as they did not have their proper date of birth, they would remember and associate the birth dates with that of the harvest time or planting time or cherry time or some time of the season of the nature, so that they could remember when they would have been born. When the other children could tell their birth date, Fredrick Douglass would often be upset why he could not tell his age or date of birth. He felt he was deprived of that opportunity, because these slave children would mingle with other children and especially the children of their landlords or their slave masters, and they would often wonder why they don't have a date of birth. If at all he made an attempt to know his age, it would sound like an impertinent attempt, that means a rude attempt in the part of the slave. If at all the slaves try to find out his birthday, it would look as if he is trying to be rude and trying to find out things which he is not supposed to. All that he could gather about his life could range the details of his life between the age of 7 years and 28 years. This is what he could remember. He didn't even know who his family members were or his close relatives were. Sometime during 1835, he heard his master say that he was 17 years old. Now, of course, his master was his father himself, or let me put it this way, his father was his master himself. But he never revealed the identity to his own son, that is Douglas, Fredrick Douglass, and instead he had been enslaved to his own father. Frederick's mother was named Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. That means they were again from the African continent, they were dark. His mother was of darker complexion than grandfather and grandmother. Frederick's father was a white man. Everyone said and whispered that his master himself was his father, but he did not have anything to prove it. He was not given an opportunity to know either. That means people used to tell that Frederick's father was his master himself. He was a white man. He would probably had taken his mother as his wife, but he never acknowledged that sonship for Fredrick Douglass. Frederick's mother was separated from him when he was an infant, and this was a normal practice, and the slave masters would not allow the mothers to be with the children because they would develop an attachment and they would even neglect work. Moreover, as the children grow, they would have more sense of security around them. Hence, the slave masters did not want that thing to happen. So, hence they used to make sure that they did not know their parents, and same thing happened in the case of Douglas also. This was a custom among the slaves, and hence the children feel no affinity. They should not feel any affection, they should not feel any attachment with the parents, and even the same thing continued even for Fredrick Douglass as well. Fredrick later came to know that in Maryland, slave children were separated from their mothers, mostly before the child attained 1 year of age, and hence there would be no affection between the mother and the child. Fredrick never had an opportunity to know his mother. He saw her only 4 or 5 times in his lifetime, that too in night times, where his mother came traveling or walking kilometers just to have a look at him. After his birth, his mother was hired by Mr. Stewart, who lived almost 12 miles away, and Frederick's mother would walk the distance on foot during the night and meet him and went back before morning. So, this used to be the common practice. So, he did not know who his mother was, or he knew who his mother was, but did not have the attachment with his mother, and because his mother used to come only in the night times, and that too traveling almost 12 miles and just to meet him, and it would have been an experience which he had once in a while, and he would not get so much attached with his mother. Frederick's mother was a field hand, and she would be whipped if she did not being present at the field during sunrise. Hence, after finishing her day's work, she travelled 12 miles just to see her child. This used to be the common practice for some years. If at all the slave asked permission to visit their beloved one, it would not be granted. If any master grants permission, he would be considered as a kind master, and most of the slave masters did not want to be known as kind slave masters. However, Fredrick Douglass never met his mother during the day, she would lie down beside him during the night, but be gone before morning. So this is how he had an experience of his mother. That too not many times, once in a while, only sometimes. But this was the plight of all the slave children during the days of Frederick Douglass. Moreover, very little communication ever took place between them. Frederick's mother died when he was about the age of 7 or so. Hence, the conversation that he could have with his mother also ended very soon, because when he was around 7 years old of age, somebody informed him that his mother was dead. So hence he did not have much interaction of his mother at all when in his childhood. Fredrick was not allowed to see his mother when she was ill, when she died, and whenever at her burial. Since he had never enjoyed his mother's affection much, even when he heard the news of her death, he felt a total detachment, or he did not get emotionally attached or upset, which one would feel at the death of a stranger. See, when he heard the news of his mother's death, he felt as if some stranger had died somewhere. He did not feel any attachment. He did not feel bad. This was something very strange. Hence, Fredrick lost his chances of knowing who his father was. If at all his mother would have been alive, when he grew up, he could have asked his mother who his father was, but he only heard his friends and others whispering that his father himself was his master himself was his father. However, by the rumors that he had heard, he gathered that his father himself or his master himself was his father. However, in most of the cases, the custom practiced and the law established was that the children of the slave women always followed the fate of and her condition. That means they would also become slaves. Now look at the condition and the plight here. The slave women had to become concubines to the slave masters, had to bear their children, but those children would not have the identity of their father. They would have the identity of their mother like a slave, and after the mother's death also they had to continue like slaves till their death as well. And most of these slaves, they would not have freedom till their death. But Douglass had a freedom because he himself became a freedom fighter for the slaves. And the law of gratification to fulfill the master's own lusts was a profitable and pleasurable agreement which gave double title to the slaveholder, that of a father and of a master, because he himself would have several children under him, so who would be his slaves, but he would enjoy the mastership because he is basically a master, but he, with the illicit relationship with the slave women, he would have had children, and hence they would not get the recognition at all. Let's move on. As far as what Fredrick could gather, such a condition would cause double misery, hardships and contempt to the children who were born out of such a relationship between the slave woman and the slave holder. First of all, they are in a constant offense to their mistress, that means the master's wife, their father's legal wife, mostly a white woman. She would often find problem with the slave children, suspecting that her husband, the slave master, is showing extra favor to his slave children. Now see, you need to understand one thing. The whole system of slavery was something like this. The slave masters used to be the white landlords or estate owners or company owners of the United States. They would have their own white wives and also children. They would get the slave men and women from the African continent, bought them at the human market or at the marketplaces, and those women who come and serve in their fields or estates as slaves were also taken as their wives, and the children born out of that wrong relationship were also treated as slaves. and after the time of the mothers, the children should still continue as slaves. And hence, all the slave children often underwent cruelty from their mistresses because their father's legal wife or mistress would always find a problem with them, thinking that they are trying to have extra favor with the slave master. That's why there was always there was a constant conflict between the slave children and the mistress of the slave master. Fredrick Douglass says that in most of the cases, the slave master is compelled to sell his slave children due to the force of his wife, so he has to sell it to somebody else. Sometimes the cruelty of this issue is seen when a slave master sells his own children to human flesh mongers, because when he cannot afford to keep them anymore with him, he would either sell them as slaves, or sometimes he would sell his daughters, slave daughters, as prostitutes, or to sell to people who were after this kind of a wrong thing. In the culture of the slave masters, if he sells his own children to human flesh mongers, he would be favoring them in some way. Otherwise, he must not only whip them himself, and should watch one of his white sons tying his own slave brother and whipping him till he bled profusely. Now, this conflict not only goes on between the mistress and the slave children, it also goes on between the slave children and their master and father's legal children. So, the legal son of a master is entitled to tie his own stepbrother to a tree or to a post and beat him till he bled, though he shared the same blood of his own father. So, this was a contradiction there. When there would be a gory wound, that means a serious wound on the slave brother's back, the white brother may be satisfied, but this would set down the parental partiality to the slave child, and also bring a miserable situation to the slave master himself, who cannot protect and defend his own child, because legally that child does not belong to him, it belongs to the slave woman. Fredrick had two masters. The first one was called Anthony. He was also called Captain Anthony. Probably he got this title because he was sailing a craft in the Chesapeake Bay sometimes, and Mr. Anthony was considered as the rich slave master, as he had nearly 30 slaves and 2 or 3 farms. So, hence he was considered to be one of the rich slave masters, and he had many people under him, and this Fredrick Douglass was one among them. Fredrick's second master was an overseer, Mr. Plummer, who was a miserable drunkard, a profane swearer, and a savage monster. He always went around with a cowskin whip and heavy cudgel. He would cut and slash women's head so horribly without any mercy. Even the masters would be enraged by his cruelty, and this was another person who was a master above him. However, the master was not a humane slave holder, for all the cruel acts of the overseer, like these people, the approval of the master was always there. If at all the master stopped, then these overseers could not really execute this kind of punishment, but masters also would support them. The master himself was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slave holding, and hence he would not have any emotions, and he would be a person so passive and indifferent to any kind of situations. Fredrick had often been awakened in the morning by a most heartrending shrieks of his own aunt, whom the master or the overseer would whip badly for doing work. The master would tie her up and would whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood, and that was the kind of slavery that that she had to undergo. No words, no tears, no prayers of his victim would ever move the slave master. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped her. Whether the blood ran fastest, he would whip the longest. It was totally inhuman and a horrible scene or spectacle to see, because such was a treatment that was given to the slaves, especially slaves during Douglas's time. The slave master would sometimes whip to make the woman to scream and sometimes to make her to blush. This would continue until he was filled with fatigue and ceased to whip and threw away the blood-clotted cow skin. This was a terrible scene. That means sometimes they wanted to make sure that the woman cried, or sometimes she would be whipped to make her blush. So till he would be satisfied, the slave master would go on beating. Fredrick recollects that he had the happiness of a deep conviction that slavery could not hold him too long within its cruel embrace. Hence, his conviction did not go from him even when he was undergoing the darkest hour of his slavery. That means he had a dream. Fredrick had a dream that one day he was going to be out of the slavery, and he started working towards it. He started fighting for the rights of the slaves, and he also got support from many people, and he became one of the freedom fighters for the slaves in America. He feels that this was God-given freedom, that he had offers thanksgiving and praise to God for this, because he had never got a opportunity to be like this when he was a child, but later he got it and he thanks God for that. So likewise, we see the story of Frederick Douglass, a slave who turned out to be a savior of slaves in America, and especially during the 1800s and in the 1900s, where millions of slaves were struggling and suffering and also demanding their own rights.